Paul, talk to us about the world economy at the moment, the global economy.
Yep.
We've got a downgrade coming from the IMF. A bit behind the times? Are you shocked in any way, shape, or form?
If you ever talk about IMF forecasts, you can automatically assume they're about 6 to 12 months behind the times, always. And for crying out loud, it's 3.6, 3.4. I mean, 0.2 is the shift. I mean, this is a rounding error. I don't think any economist on the planet believes that economic data is accurate enough to give you a 0.5 range for GDP. This is just the IMF going for headlines. It's largely nonsensical. As far as China is concerned, I think there is a problem in China. I think there's a real risk China's economy is overheating. Remember, the trend rate of growth for China, according to most economists today, is somewhere between 5 and 5.5%. We are going to be sitting here for the next 5 years saying China's growth rate has hit the lowest for 25, 26, 27, 28 years. Every year, you're going to be hitting a new low because China's growth rate absolutely must go down from where it is today. It is too high today. It needs to come down to its trend rate of 5 to 5.5 over the next couple of years.
And are they therefore making the right transition at the moment, focusing on the consumer, moving away from manufacturing, and they need to ramp up the pace of change?
Well, absolutely. I mean, they're not moving away from manufacturing. That's not what they're doing. What they're trying to do is raise the consumer share of GDP. So they're not saying we want to shrink the manufacturing sector. That's not what the Chinese are doing. What they're saying is we want to expand the consumer sector. And absolutely, if you look at an economy that is roughly equivalent standard of living, Indonesia, slightly higher standard of living than China, but an economy like Indonesia, you're talking about the consumer being about 60–65% of the economy. That's ultimately where China needs to get to, and we're nowhere near there at the moment. So it's a process of evolution over the next couple of years.
Paul Donovan, I like your analysis of China and their ability to get to their new trend growth, but if you imply their trend growth is 5-ish, where is trend growth for Europe? Where is trend growth for America?
Well, trend growth for Europe and the States hasn't come down as much as it has in China because China's big issues in terms of trend. It's being hit on both sides. The demographics of China has toppled over. So the demographics, which is one of the key drivers of growth, has shifted. And then the other thing is productivity. China is now a middle-income economy. Productivity growth is going to be substantially lower. If we look at somewhere like the States, I'd say trend for the States is 2 3/4, give or take. And trend for Europe is probably about 1.25%. So in the States, we're operating at about trend growth at the moment. In Europe, we're above trend growth, but this has been after, a fairly hideous period. So you'd expect Europe to be above trend growth right at the moment. It'll settle back down to 1.25, maybe 1.5 trend growth if some of the reforms actually start to bite in places like Italy and Spain.
Paul, a careful read of economic history suggests that the sole solution is currency depreciation or even outright devaluation. After looking at these GDP numbers today, is that the only path for Beijing, a weaker renminbi?
Weaker renminbi won't do any good at all to the Chinese economy. The problem is that currencies don't work the way that they worked 40 years ago. 40 years ago, if you depreciated your currency, your exports got cheaper. But that's not the world today. We've now got far, far more complicated global supply chains, and generally speaking, if you weaken your currency, you don't then end up with lower lower export prices, and you don't then end up with an increase in export market share. If you look at what China's done, the movement in the renminbi so far absolutely is not a competitive devaluation because it's not being reflected in export prices. If it's not reflected in export prices, there is no competitive advantage. There is no increase in market share for exporters.